One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed. More pools formed. More riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
So, wolves are acting as a keystone species. It's a single species that's maintaining the biotic structure of the ecosystem, but also that has a disproportionate impact on that ecosystem. So if you get rid of that one species, like when we hunted all the wolves and got rid of them, it really changed what that ecosystem was, upset the whole balance. So another species would be the starfish, that feeds on mussels in an aquatic system, keeping them from blanketing the rocks so that all the other organisms that you might find in a tide pool can exist. When we're looking at competition, we have two different kinds of competition. Intraspecific competition is between members of the same species. So an example of that would be territoriality, when members of the same species are fighting over the same kind of resource. Wolves are going to create their own territories where they're going to be able to get all the different resources within that territory, all the food, all the everything there is. Songbirds, they fight too. They're fighting over their own territories to nest in among members and to find food among members of their same species. So you can think wolves are going to be fighting much differently than a songbird. Interspecific competition is between different species. So in a grassland, you've got all different kinds of grasses, and all of them are trying to access those soil nutrients. So in order to live together, they've got to do it in different ways. Some grasses are going to have a fibrous root system. Fibrous just means very thin roots that aren't all that long. So they're going to be getting the resources up at the top of the soil layer. So only up in here. Whereas the dandelion, for example, has a long taproot. A lot of our weeds that are really hard to pull have that long taproot. They're going to be accessing resources much deeper. So with introduced species, we're going to go through quite a lot of these. Now, an important thing to note is just because you introduce a species doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. Okay, so there's a difference between introduced species, sometimes we call these exotic species, alien species, and the bad ones within that are called invasive species. So invasive ones are the bad ones, which is pretty much all the ones on this list. So rabbits, for example, these were brought in by Australian hunters. They thought it was a great idea to have things to hunt, but you can see the rabbits destroyed the ecosystem. They totally overgrazed all that grass to the point which that grass was not growing back. So they did a lot to try and fence out the area, and you can see just a big difference between where those rabbits could roam and populate and eat up all the resources and where they were kept out of. So what do you do in a situation like that? For some species, again, we introduced them because they thought it might have been a good idea. But without any predators, they're just going to outcompete. With our rabbits, though, again, they didn't have any of those enemies, so they outcompeted. They're overabundant. They devastated the natural environment. So the idea, one idea at least, to try to control that population, what about coming up with some kind of disease that's going to kill rabbits? Okay. Now, why wouldn't that work in the long term? So, reason, hopefully you guys thought of it, is that we have evolution, okay? If you bring in a disease to try to attack any kind of organism, that organism being attacked could very well develop resistance to that disease. And then you still have a lot of rabbits and nothing to do with them. So looking at evolution, mechanisms of species adaptation. All of this is change through natural selection. So different kinds of selective pressures are going to determine which organisms survive and reproduce and which ones are eliminated. The ones that can survive and reproduce are going to pass on whatever gene it was that allowed them to survive. The ones that didn't have that gene, so here the shorter-necked animals, they were not able to survive, so then those shorter-necked genes, after many, many generations, will no longer be in that gene pool, in the genes within that breeding population. So in order for change to take place, you need differences in genes. If you don't have genetic diversity, it's not going to happen. And then you have to have some kind of environmental pressure, something that's going to affect the species. Only then will adaptations be able to take place, okay? Or will you have adaptations of those creatures or plants or whatever organism it is. So natural selection can be for certain characteristics, or it might be against other characteristics, other phenotypes within the population. For adaptations to the environment, you can imagine anything that's going to help that organism survive. The roots of plants, the ability to escape predation, so either running away or hiding or other defense mechanisms. Plants are going to have those same types of mechanisms, but just in their own way. Finding and attracting mates or however they need to reproduce. Migration, ability to travel and spread that population or survive in different times of the year. For limits to change, any organism only has 3 options in response to a change. And typically we're talking about some kind of environmental change. They can adapt, and again, that's not going to happen with an individual organism. That's going to be happening over the entire population and over many, many, many generations. They can move, so migrate somewhere where that change might not be affecting them, or that species is going to go extinct. They're going to die. Different species are at risk or not at risk for extinction. Things that are going to make a species more vulnerable to extinction is a narrow distribution, so not being able to tolerate a wide range of factors. Having a small population to begin with. Limited genetic variation, lower biotic potential, longer generation, smaller number of offsprings, limited ability to migrate, and many of these vulnerable species are going to be much larger species, okay? K-selected species. Organisms that they're probably going to survive one way or another are highly adaptive species. They're have wider distribution, large population size. They're typically smaller in physical size, high biotic potential, short generation times, larger number of offspring. So any kind of change is going to be magnified by the number of offspring they have in those short generation times. So these are typically our R-selected species. For prerequisites for speciation, so in order for a new species to come about, that original population must separate into smaller populations that are no longer interbreeding with each other. So think of some ways that this might happen. So hopefully you are able to come up with some ways like a river cutting through a population, or so you've got one population on one side of the river, another population on the other side. You might have a hurricane blow a member of a population or many members of a population off to a far off area that they weren't inhabiting before, maybe to even an island. So different ways to separate those populations. Once you have those two populations in different areas, they have to be exposed to different selective pressures. So for example, we've got the Arctic fox and the gray fox.